Trump just handed Canada the strongest negotiating position in North American trade history, and he did it all by himself. 5 demands. That's what the United States put on the table. 5 conditions Trump expects Canada to surrender before agreeing to extend the most important trade agreement on the continent: dairy, digital media, provincial alcohol rules, government procurement, and energy policy. 5 demands designed to reshape the entire relationship between the 2 biggest trading partners in the world. Mark Carney looked at that list and said no, not to 1 demand, not to 2, to every single one. And that isn't stubbornness, that's strategy. Because every demand Trump made reveals something Washington desperately needs from Canada. And Carney knows exactly what it is. Today, we're breaking down how Trump's own demands accidentally exposed just how dependent the United States really is on Canada. Why each refusal makes Canada stronger instead of weaker. How the upcoming trade agreement review is turning into a chess match where Carney holds more leverage than anyone in Washington expected. And why the United States walking away from this deal would hit American workers, American consumers, and American manufacturers far harder than the Trump administration wants to admit. But before we dive in, if you appreciate in-depth analysis like this, hit that like button and subscribe to stay informed on the stories that truly matter. So what are these 5 demands? U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer stood before Congress and laid them out clearly. No rumors, no guessing. A public list of conditions Canada must meet if the agreement is going to be extended for another 16 years. Demand number 1. Dairy. The United States wants expanded access to Canada's dairy market. Right now, American dairy producers can ship limited amounts into Canada, tariff-free, but anything above that cap gets hit with tariffs between 200% and 298%. Greer called Canada's supply management system unfair. He argued it blocks American producers from competing on equal terms. Carney's response came immediately: supply management is not on the table, period. And he delivered that message in French. A deliberate signal aimed directly at Quebec, where the dairy industry supports thousands of families and supply management is politically untouchable. Canada even passed legislation in June to make that commitment permanent. Not a promise, a law. Greer can demand whatever he wants. The door is legally locked. Demand number 2. Digital media. Canada's Online Streaming Act brought Netflix, Spotify, YouTube, and other platforms under Canadian broadcasting rules, forcing them to invest part of their revenue into Canadian content. Canada's Online News Act also requires platforms to compensate Canadian publishers when they link to or republish news content. Greer called both laws discriminatory against American tech companies. He claimed they create unfair barriers against U.S. digital service providers. Canada's position is simple. These laws protect Canadian culture, Canadian journalism, and Canadian voices. Without them, American platforms would dominate the market and erase domestic content. Carney has shown no interest in touching either law, because dismantling them would mean surrendering cultural sovereignty to Silicon Valley. And that's a trade Canada isn't willing to make. Demand number 3. Provincial alcohol bans. Several Canadian provinces banned American beer and wine in direct retaliation for Trump's tariffs. Ontario, British Columbia, and others joined. Greer now wants those bans removed as a condition for extending the agreement. But here's what Washington is ignoring. Those bans exist because Trump imposed tariffs first. Remove the tariffs and the bans disappear. But Greer is demanding Canada lift the bans while the tariffs remain in place. That is a negotiation. That's demanding Canada absorb punishment without fighting back. Carney isn't going to agree to that. The bans stay until the tariffs come down. Demand number 4. Government procurement. Greer flagged what he called discriminatory procurement policies in Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia, accusing provincial governments of buying Canadian products instead of American ones. He wants those policies changed. But procurement is not some unique Canadian violation. Every country protects its own suppliers when it can. The United States does it constantly through Buy American rules, Made in America requirements, military procurement preferences, and domestic supplier mandates across industries from steel to software. So Washington demanding Canada stop buying Canadian, while America keeps buying American, isn't a legitimate grievance. It's hypocrisy dressed up as negotiation. Demand number 5. Energy policy. Greer raised complaints about Alberta's treatment of electricity distribution providers in Montana. The allegation is that Alberta's grid operator favors in-province energy generation over cross-border imports from the United States during certain periods. Alberta's utilities minister rejected the accusation entirely, but the biggest story runs in the opposite direction. The United States imports roughly 3.8 million barrels of Canadian crude oil every single day. About 23% of American refinery feedstock comes from Canada. Gulf Coast refineries were built specifically to process Canadian heavy sour crude. New England states also rely on Canadian electricity to keep the lights on during winter peaks. The energy relationship isn't one way, it flows both ways, and Canada's role in that flow is irreplaceable. Why refusing everything is actually the smartest move. Most people assume saying no to 5 demands weakens Canada, that it makes Canada look uncooperative, that it gives Trump ammunition to threaten withdrawal. But Carney isn't just refusing, he's refusing while holding leverage Washington desperately needs. Because each demand is an accidental confession. Trump wants dairy access expanded. That means American dairy producers are struggling and need Canadian consumers. Trump wants digital media laws changed. That means American tech companies are losing billions because Canada forces them to invest locally. Trump wants procurement rules weakened. That means Canadian governments are successfully keeping money inside Canada instead of sending it to US suppliers. Every demand reveals the same truth. Canada is doing something that benefits Canadians and the United States wants in. Greer didn't publish a list of Canadian weaknesses, he published a list of Canadian policies that are working, and Carney's job is to defend every single one. The biggest leverage was never even mentioned: automobiles. Look at what the demand list did not include: cars, and that silence says everything. The North American auto industry is deeply interconnected. Canadian plants build parts that end up in American trucks. American plants build engines that go into Canadian vehicles. And supply chains cross the border again and again before a finished car is even completed. That is why major automakers warned Congress that the trade agreement is essential. The American Automotive Policy Council, representing the Detroit Three, said the deal saves tens of billions of dollars through integrated production. GM President Mark Carney admitted the supply chain complexity is enormous, yet the US president still imposed Section 232 tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and autos, disrupting the very system American manufacturers depend on. Now those same manufacturers are pressuring Washington not to let the agreement collapse. Carney knows it. That is why autos remain Canada's hidden weapon. If the trade agreement falls apart, American carmakers suffer more than anyone. Carney's China move changed the entire game. Carney traveled to Beijing and negotiated what he called friendly nation trade tariffs with China. It was not a free trade agreement. It was a targeted arrangement meant to remove barriers on canola, electric vehicles, and agricultural exports that had been hurting Canadian farmers for years. At first, the US president praised the move. Then he reversed course within days. He posted online threatening 100% tariffs if Canada became a drop-off port for China. Carney responded immediately. Canada is not pursuing a free trade agreement with China. The arrangement does not violate the trade agreement, and it does not trigger the China clause that would allow the United States to terminate the deal. Canada's Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc clarified this directly to Greer. Greer understood, but the real impact was not about canola or electric vehicles. It was about proving Canada has options, that Canadian exporters are not permanently dependent on the US market. Every alternative trade route Canada builds makes it easier for Carney to walk away from a bad deal. 3 paths starting in July. Starting in July, there are 3 options. Extend the agreement for 16 years, withdraw entirely, or trigger annual reviews that drag negotiations forward until the deal expires in 2036. Most analysts assume Canada will accept whatever Washington offers because the alternative is worse. But that assumption belongs to the old Canada, the Canada that sent 75% of its exports to the United States and had no backup plan. Carney's Canada is different. China now offers agricultural export routes into the world's second-largest economy. European partnerships are expanding. The Buy Canadian policy redirects $70 billion toward domestic suppliers. Critical minerals now give Canada leverage that did not exist 5 years ago, because the United States needs them to compete with China in clean energy and artificial intelligence. If the agreement is not extended, annual reviews begin. That creates a decade of uncertainty. But uncertainty hurts American companies just as much as Canadian ones, and American industry leaders are already panicking. Nearly 150 US business leaders told Congress the agreement must continue. Steel producers, automakers, energy companies, agricultural exporters. They are watching Greer's demands and quietly hoping Canada does not actually refuse everything. But Canada is refusing everything, and the American business community will be the first to pressure the US president to return with reasonable terms. Davos. Carney reshaped the global narrative before the demand list was even published. Carney went to the World Economic Forum in Davos and delivered a speech that reframed the entire conversation. He warned that smaller nations should never accept economic subordination from larger powers. He said, if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. The room erupted in applause. European leaders praised the speech. Journalists called it the most significant address by a Canadian leader in a generation. The US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent responded within days, calling it virtue signaling and accusing Carney of building power on anti-American politics. But Bessent missed the point. The speech was not about insulting Washington. It was about building coalitions, a network of middle powers, Canada, Europe, the Indo-Pacific, united by the same fear, economic coercion from dominant states. Washington knows the deal matters, even if the US president pretends it does not. Here is the contradiction. The US president claims the agreement is irrelevant. He says it offers no advantage. He calls it transitional and suggests it may have outlived its purpose. But Greer told Congress the United States exported $960 billion in goods and services to Canada and Mexico under the agreement. He admitted exports rose 56% since it took effect. He confirmed that business and labor groups overwhelmingly wanted to continue. You do not spend months laying out conditions for extending a deal you believe is meaningless. The US president is posturing, but the data tells the truth. The United States needs this agreement. It needs Canadian energy, Canadian auto parts, Canadian critical minerals, and Canadian supply chains. Greer's demand list is not just a list of what the US president wants. It is a list that exposes how much Washington depends on Ottawa, and Carney is reading it carefully. The US president's public snub only strengthened Carney. The US president invited Carney to join his Board of Peace initiative for Gaza, then publicly withdrew the invitation on social media after the Davos speech. He posted a formal letter uninviting Canada, calling the board the most prestigious assembly of leaders ever. The snub made international headlines. But it was exactly the wrong move, because now every demand Washington makes looks less like negotiation and more like bullying. And every refusal from Carney looks like strength. The US president thought humiliating Carney would weaken him politically. Instead, it made Carney look like the adult in the room, a leader who will not be manipulated, a prime minister who puts Canadian interests above staying in Washington's good graces. What Carney built while the US president was posting the refusal to accept 5 demands is not just a negotiating stance. It is the result of months of preparation. China arrangements opened new agricultural routes. Davos helped build international support. By Canadian policies redirected domestic spending. Critical mineral strategies made Canada indispensable to us clean energy and artificial intelligence goals. Provinces aligned behind federal trade strategy. Auto sector coordination strengthened Canada's most powerful leverage point.